Hello everyone, hope you're well. This is the video lecture for the IT audit topic. It's going to be, the slide deck that I'm using is a combination of some material I received from one of the big four firms, from KPMG. Please don't take this as an endorsement of KPMG. Other firms have similar slide decks. This just happened to be the one I've used in the past, and I'm merging it with some Chapter 8 material as well. So the big picture here is IT audit is going to be, the way I'm going to talk about it is largely going to be in relation to how it supports the financial statement audit, even though we will discuss a little bit about IT audits in different contexts. We're going to focus a little bit more about how it ultimately impacts the financial statement audit. So let's look and see how we're going to review these learning objectives for Chapter 8 and how we'll weave in this information. So looking at these learning objectives here, again, I'm going to have priorities. I'm not going to talk about learning objective 7. When we talk about audit analytics, we'll actually pick that topic up of generalized audit software. And notice here a lot of our high is starting to get into these learning objectives 4 through 6. Those are the ones we're going to spend the most time on because those are most relevant to the financial statement audit. So why is IT audit relevant? Kind of a big picture first. Obviously information technology is used extensively throughout firms, and so because of that there's more opportunities for auditing the information that is collected, processed, and disseminated through information technology. And it's important that a host of individuals through accountants, auditors, folks that are creating the information systems need to think about risks and controls that can help mitigate those risks. And so IT audit is really foundational for making sure that information technology is providing the most value that it can, right? And so, you know, IT audit is definitely a field that there's a lot of relevance in what we need to understand financial statement audits. So just big picture here, risk and controls. Risks is just the probability something negative is going to happen. Could be internal or external. IT risk is just a specific risk related to the use and operation of IT within companies. Internal controls, which we've already talked about, is basically a process to make sure we have reasonable assurance that the objectives are met. And then audit we've been talking about as a basically an assurance vehicle where we're looking to see whether certain standards, certain assertions are being met, and so we can kind of combine all that together when we think about IT audit as basically an assurance service to ensure that IT risks are being mitigated and controlled in an effective way. We've talked about the COSO cube before. A lot of times, you know, there's going to be different areas that IT fits in. A pretty significant area is going to be around the control activities, right? Because we have the physical controls and we have the IT controls. Also, it's going to play a large part in making sure that monitoring is effective. It's going to help make sure that the information that is circulated throughout the firm and outside of the firm has all those attributes that we need. And there would even be an element in the control environment in the sense of the IT governance, right? That would also be something that could be in the control environment in terms of, is there a CIO? Does the CIO report to the CEO? Is it a separate C-suite, right? Those kind of things could also be part of the control environment. So those are some pretty significant ways in which IT controls would impact. You could even look, I mean, part of risk assessment is deciding, do we want to even build, right, like IT controls into the system to mitigate the risk. So really there's kind of roles for IT audit and IT controls really throughout the control framework. So this Learning Objective 2 really ties in with me in terms of the IT architecture. And so thinking about this, right, we have users that access the operating system within a firm's IT environment, right? A lot of times it's paired with the network login at the same time. So when you're logging in to the operating system, you're also logging in simultaneously to the network. Let's say there's an ERP that's being used that you sign into, and so you're going to have different applications within the ERP system that you would be able to get access to based on your sign-in. Those applications are where you're going to be doing actions, right, like creating purchase orders or paying off invoices, things of that nature. There's a database management system that usually sits between the ERP and the actual database files. So the database management system is just a piece of software that helps to access and control access to the actual files. It's communicating with the operating system, which has to communicate with all the hardware, right? That's another role of the operating system, is communicate with all the hardware. And so the hardware, which understands things in zeros and ones, needs that translation between the operating system and the software. And so you get the actual files that are stored on the hard disks, and these could be local or network resources. From out of ERP, then it's usually going to be network resources that are where data is being stored. And so this kind of process together, we need to make sure this entire process is well controlled, right? That we don't have back doors that are sitting open, that we don't have weak security on these areas. And so really this is a pretty important area. Up here, let's see if I can write, is the idea that we need backups for all of this, right? So we're going to have backup procedures. That's terrible. We need backup procedures for backing up the operating system, the ERP application, the database management system, and then obviously the actual data, right? Because we want to make sure that in the event of a loss of data or loss of hardware, that we can replicate the entire system, right? Or rather the firm can. So when I'm coming in as an IT auditor, I want to make sure that they have a backup recovery or disaster recovery plan, and that their backups are an integral part of that plan. So if we think about the different types of controls that we have, that's can get to Learning Objective 3 and 4, we can have kind of the overall controls, kind of that are more part of the control environment, I would suppose, that are kind of tone at the top issues that impact IT controls in general. Application controls, these are going to be a set of IT controls where we're going to see these are actually built into the application. So for example, SAP has a procurement application that is used to acquire inventory, and so if there's a approval for a purchase request, or excuse me, if there's a purchase request, then one control that can be built in is that the system requires approval before they're going to process the purchase request and turn it into a purchase order, right? And so that's something that can be configured into the ERP system itself. And in general, we can have a set of approvals and authorizations and verifications of things through the application, the IT account information system. We can also have segregation of duties that are occurring where we're actually assigning different, not just the different responsibilities, but also the different rights and privileges to do things within the IT applications, right? And so segregation of duties is a physical control that we've talked about in the past, and we'll talk about more as we go, but we can put that into the applications to where only certain individuals can do certain activities, right? So it's a way to help implement segregation duties and access control at the same time. And really we're kind of missing one other category here. These would be general controls. General and these are IT controls. Just like the application controls are IT, and the segregation of duties can be done in IT. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes, but if I want to make a more complete list in terms of controls that can be in the IT environment, I would definitely want to include IT general controls. Okay. And so this slide just kind of shows how these might fit together. You have a set of transactions. You're going to be using the IT environment, and so you have controls that are related to all the applications. So no matter what you're doing, if you're doing it in the IT environment, you'll have general controls that would be a part of that. So for example, security around the operating system, who could even get access to the computer, right? That's a general control. That doesn't matter what you're trying to do on a computer, you have to go through that control, right? But let's say that you're, for example, let's continue our purchase request, our purchase requisition example. And so we have this procurement application, and so we might have specific controls like that approval over a certain amount. That would be an application control activity. And so if you have situations where you're looking at reports from what users are doing, or maybe activity, maybe you want to look for all the transactions over that dollar amount, and showing who approved them, then you could create a user report, for example, and then you'd have a set of user control activities where actual individuals are doing these checks to make sure that what is happening through the IT system is what's supposed to happen, right? And so that's an example of a user report being used for the user, like for example a manager, to go back and verify to make sure that control was actually operating appropriately. And then you might get exception reports from certain things in terms of things that require follow-up, right? So maybe there's a control activity that needs to be implemented for a subset of transactions, and so we might have those kind of things that are being pulled out and then subject to manual application control activities. And so then digging back into the general controls, the general IT controls, we have 4 types, and different groups can lump these in different ways. I've just found this is a nice way, seems to make sense in my head for how we want to consider it. And so the first one is basically access controls, right? So we're talking about access to the IT assets. So whether that's the software assets or we're talking about hardware assets, those are part of the access, logical access control. So what is the process that is used to make sure that we're granting appropriate access to appropriate individuals? And then what's the process to terminate access? For example, if we're going to fire someone, when does their access get revoked? How quickly can we do that? What are the steps that need to happen? Questions around part of what IT auditors are going to look for is reviewing, okay, let me look, for example, at the system administrators and see, are those individuals the ones that are supposed to have administrator access in the system, since they can do a lot, right? And so we'd look for things like that. Are the password parameters enforced? But even more specifically, usually, is what are the password policies, right? How hard does that password need to be? How often does it need to be changed? Those kinds of things. Program changes is another area which we'll talk about in a little more detail. But those are basically any changes to the applications. What's the process used to make sure that those changes are authorized, that they're tested appropriately, and let's make sure that those changes don't cause other problems with other parts of the application. And so the program change is a pretty important area to make sure that we don't have individuals that are manipulating the IT environment in order to achieve objectives that are contrary to the firm's objectives. And then what we're going to be looking for is segregation of duties around the IT environment, right? And so we'll look for things like, are the programmers, let me use text instead. Are the programmers separate from the folks that manage the database, who are separate from the folks that actually run the actual applications and run the different jobs that need to happen, right? And so a lot of times we'll look at these three areas to make sure that we have good segregation of duties. Because if you start letting someone make a change, give them access to the underlying data, and allow them to run a job on their own, then they can commit a fraud pretty easily, right? And so we want to avoid that. So we'll segregate, since so much is done with the applications now and through the software, we want to segregate who can do what in relation to those applications, to make sure that we don't have fraud and error. Then the next piece is the idea of program development. And so largely what we're thinking about here is either new applications or very large changes to applications. Like say you want to implement in SAP, right? And so if you want to implement that in, what is the process that the firm used to decide on SAP? What is the process they used to look at the user requirements? What kind of testing did they do? Who's in charge of making the configurations for the application when it's implemented, right? All those things. It's a long process, and so making sure that process is well controlled. You know, if it's large enough, did the board approve of such a large purchase, for example? Because those are not, the implementation of these ERP systems is not cheap, right? And so looking at all stages of that program development lifecycle would be another area that the IT auditors would look at as far as the general IT controls. And then kind of the last section is computer operations. So this would be things related to backups. Is there maintenance on the hardware being done? Do we have good security on the actual equipment? So a lot of this I'm going to be looking at, like data center controls. So do you have, is the data center secured? Who gets to have access to it? You know, if we go back to that type number 2, do we have individuals that are getting, that are programmers that get access to the data center? Because the data center is where the operations folks usually are going to be doing their jobs, and so we don't want programmers or database individuals that are in charge of managing the database to have access. So who gets to actually have access to the data center? You know, is there proper fire suppression? Is there proper power backups in the event of losing security? All these things, right? Are there windows, right? Is it subject to possible weather, poor weather? All these things will go into kind of evaluating whether the computer operations are well controlled, as well as kind of a big picture, what are the disaster recovery plans, right? What's the business continuity plan in the event of losing data, whether it's a certain amount of data for a day or a week or a month, or whether it's losing the actual data center, right? The data center is destroyed. What is our plan for recovering from something like that? Or specifically, what is the firm's plan for recovering from an event like that? Okay, so next, application control activities. We can think about this in a couple ways. One, we already kind of mentioned this idea that we're going to have some exception reports and some manual follow-up. So let me focus instead on these program control activities. You can think about these in a couple different categories. Validating the input, right? So limit tests would just be, you know, we shouldn't see a request for a payment above, you know, $1 million or whatever the threshold is for the firm, right? Assuming that's a relatively small firm. We shouldn't see, as far as a validity test, is it a valid customer number, right? Let's say you're going to put in an accounts receivable, well, and you're going to put in a customer number, well, it has to match up with a current customer number. Allowed characters would be things around, let's say you have a date field. Well, there shouldn't be any letters in a date field, right? There should only be numbers, either slashes or dashes to kind of, or possibly no slashes or dashes, depending on the format of the date that you're going to allow. can you test for missing data? So if you try and enter an invoice and the details of an invoice, but you leave out the total amount, right, then the program would say, okay, you need to stop there and fix it. So all these validation checks are trying to make sure that bad input doesn't make it into the system, because once it gets in, then it's just going to cause problems down the road. And so we'd rather prevent it, and so this would be in a category of a preventive control, is to make sure that we have good valid input before we actually send it downstream as far as the rest of the processing. A self-checking number would just be something, so if you had a customer number, you could create customer numbers that have a check digit at the end, right? So let's say you have a 6-digit customer number, and the first 5 digits then get put into some algorithm to generate the 6th digit. And so if you have something like that, then anytime someone tries to put in a customer number, the program can run the algorithm on those first 5, calculate what the 6th digit should be, and then if it doesn't match what is input, then it tells you, wait a minute, this is not a valid number, right? And so that's a way to prevent possible mistyping, because those other tests aren't going to necessarily, or may not necessarily check if there's a problem. So this is just another way to check, kind of an internal check within the number that can be used to validate the input. Batch controls are just the idea that we're going to move things through in batches a lot of times. Let's say we have a lot of invoices, and that we're sending out to our customers, right? We're going to bill them for it, but before we get to that place, it's going to go through a process of verifying that it's a customer. And so when we do that, for example, let's say we have 20 invoices and we send it through this validation program, well, then we should have 20 invoices at the end of that, right? If we lose any, we need to know why we lose any. And so batch controls help make sure that the integrity of the process is still there. And so if we start getting errors that drop out, we have to make sure that we want the application to be able to reconcile and understand, so we're not losing things, right? If one of our assertions is completeness, we don't want to all of a sudden lose a transaction, or we don't want to gain a transaction, right? We don't want duplicates somehow to get inserted into it either. And so batch controls help make sure that that those things don't happen. And so we can count the items in the batch. We can do a control total. Let's say if it's invoices, we can add up the total invoices, right? And so if we do that before a process and after a process, those things should equal. Hash total would be adding up like a number that isn't really meant to be added up, right? So if you had customer numbers, for example, customer number field, and those are all numbers in the customer number field, you can add it up and it creates a hash total, and that doesn't mean anything, right? It's not like it has a specific meaning, but it's a total that shouldn't change from from before a process to after a process, right? It should still be the same. And so those are 3 different ways that we can use to make sure that we're not having any problems as we're moving transactions through the different processes. And then processing controls are just a different category, although it's fairly similar. A lot of times what the processing is really from one batch to the next, right? So it's kind of like the sequence of batches. So it's input controls to make sure that what we're doing is valid into a batch, and then we're also, right, if we have like a series of batches, that's how I usually think about processing controls, is that as we're moving through the sequence, right, we make sure that the input here lines up with the output here, right, and vice versa. We're having controls to make sure from one jump to the other that we're not losing or contorting or distorting in the information.